Welcome to the Theology Made podcast. I'm Jordan. In today's episode, we're going to look at why St. Patrick was nothing like the version we celebrate. Once a year, St. Patrick shows up everywhere, on t-shirts, beer labels, parade floats. He's Irish, he's cheerful, he's green, and he banished snakes. And none of that has much to do with the real man. The historical Patrick is quieter, and frankly, harder to turn into a mascot, which is probably why we replaced him. Let's start with the most basic correction. St. Patrick was not Irish. He was British, Roman Britain to be precise. Born sometime in the late 4th century, Patrick grew up on the edge of the collapsing Roman world. His family was Christian. His father was a deacon, his grandfather was a priest. And Patrick himself, by his own admission, was indifferent. Later in life, when he writes his short spiritual autobiography, he doesn't paint himself as especially devout or impressive. He says he didn't really know God, didn't take faith seriously, didn't pay attention. And then when he was around 16 years old, his life ended. Not metaphorically, but actually. Raiders came from Ireland, not the football kind. And that part really matters, because Ireland at this time wasn't Christian, it wasn't Roman, it was tribal, it was violent, and it was fragmented. And Patrick is taken from his home, transported across the sea, and sold into slavery. There is no warning, there's no choice, there's no explanation, and he would spend the next 6 years working as a shepherd, alone, hungry, exposed, cut off from family, language, and everything familiar. This is where the story usually gets cleaned up. But Patrick doesn't clean it up. He says, I'm afraid, I'm lonely. He cries out constantly, and this is where his faith really begins. It's not in a cathedral, it's not in comfort, but it's in the survival of his life. And Patrick doesn't describe a sudden conversion. It's not this dramatic altar call or a single moment of clarity. It's slow. He begins to pray because there's nothing else to do. At first out of fear, then out of habit, and eventually out of trust. He writes that he prayed hundreds of times a day. Faith for Patrick isn't philosophical. It's what happens when everything else is stripped away. And then unexpectedly, he hears a voice. Again, not a metaphorical one. A voice telling him to leave. Patrick runs. Desperately. According to his own account, he walks for days, maybe weeks, across unfamiliar territory. No map, no protection. Just the conviction that staying means disappearing. Eventually, he reaches the coast. There's a ship. Its destination uncertain. The crew doesn't want him. A runaway slave is a liability. Patrick is refused. Only later, after he turns away and prays, do they call him back. Even here, nothing is clean or heroic. The journey home is long, it's disorienting. At one point, Patrick and the crew are stranded without food. They wander for weeks again, this time in a foreign land, again exposed and hungry. But somehow, he survives and he makes it home. And this is where most stories would stop. Escape, freedom, relief. But Patrick doesn't write about relief. He writes about distance. He is home, but not whole. The world he returns to hasn't changed, but he has. He knows he lacks education. He says it openly, almost painfully. Years of isolation have stripped him of what little formal learning he had. His Latin is rough. His writing is awkward. He compares himself unfavorably to others. He anticipates criticism before it comes, and it does come. Patrick feels out of place among Christians who are confident, articulate, secure. He doesn't see himself as a natural leader, much less a missionary. But he senses something's unfinished. So he does the only thing he can. He pursues training. It's slow, it's imperfect, always aware of the gap between who he is and who he thinks he should be. And yet, even in this quieter season of life, the past still has a hold on him. But not in a bad way. Patrick dreams. Not pleasant dreams, but they're persistent ones. He hears voices, faces returning, the landscape of Ireland reappearing uninvited. They're not visions of triumph, they are these interruptions that the trauma hasn't stayed behind on the island, it's followed him home. But eventually those dreams take a sharper shape, and they begin to become a summons. That the very people who enslaved him are calling him back, not for punishment, but to receive something from him. And this is the point where Patrick's story turns from survival to vocation. And it's not a turn he welcomes. Patrick has a vision. In it he hears the voice of the Irish, the very people who enslaved him, calling him back. Come and walk among us. This is the moment where the story stops being inspirational and starts getting really uncomfortable. Because forgiveness, that's one thing. Returning, that's another. Patrick doesn't want this. He argues with God. He points lack of education, weakness, fear. But against every instinct, he goes. And Patrick doesn't arrive in Ireland as a conquering hero. There's no imperial escort, there's no state protection, there's no legal recognition. Unlike missionaries who would come centuries later, Patrick's not backed by Rome, because Rome barely exists anymore in the way it once did. Ireland lies completely outside the Roman world. No cities in the Roman sense, no centralized government, no roads, courts, or bureaucracy Patrick can lean on. Ireland is tribal, power's local, kinship determines loyalty. Land, cattle, and honor shape social order. And at the center of that system stands the Druids. And the Druids are not just religious figures. They're judges, poets, advisors, memory keepers. They preserve law through oral tradition. They shape kings through counsel and curse. In other words, religion, politics, and culture are really fused together. And Patrick, he understands this quickly, which is why he doesn't try to overthrow it. And he has no leverage to do so. And even if he did, it would fail. Instead, Patrick goes back to what he knows, doing things slower. He learns the language, not just conversationally, but culturally. He learns how honor works, hospitality works, how shame and loyalty operate inside clans. He respects local customs where conscience allows. He doesn't demand Romanization. He doesn't import foreign hierarchy wholesale. And I think this is really significant because Christianity had often traveled alongside Roman order. But in Ireland, the scaffolding isn't there. If faith's going to take root, it's because God wants it to, and it has to stand on its own. So Patrick doesn't preach mass rallies. He doesn't target kings first as a shortcut to influence. There's no spectacle. He enters relationships. He stays with families. He listens. He answers questions slowly. And conversion happens quietly, one household at a time, one clan at a time. And baptisms are personal, not performative. Faith is growing through trust. And Patrick is very careful about leadership. He doesn't rule communities from a distance. He ordains local leaders, men who understand the land, the people, the rhythms of life. So Christianity in Ireland, it doesn't remain a foreign religion because Patrick refused to keep it foreign. The communities that form are small. They're fragile. They're often contested. Patrick himself is threatened repeatedly. He's robbed, chained, nearly killed, and yet he stays. And this is not a triumph story. There's no moment where all of Ireland converts. But what does happen is something slow and harder to measure. Christian communities become places of refuge. They begin to challenge practices like infanticide and human trafficking. Not through law, they don't have that control, but through presence. They offer an alternative vision of power, belonging, and worth. And over time, decades and then generations, that difference accumulates. But it wasn't through force. It was through faithfulness. Patrick doesn't conquer Ireland. He lives among it long enough for the gospel to sound like good news in its own accent. And that kind of work doesn't make legends easily, but it changes cultures. Patrick faced constant resistance, threatened, mocked, accused. At one point, he's accused by other Christians, leaders who question his legitimacy and background. Remember, Patrick's not highly educated by Roman standards. He knows it, they know it, and it haunts him. And his writings return again and again to his own inadequacy. He calls himself a sinner, unlearned, a failure in the eyes of many. And it's not so much a propped up false humility, it's his lived experience. And then Patrick, he doesn't erase Irish culture. He doesn't civilize it in the Roman sense. What he does is subvert it from within. Again, he challenges infanticide. He undermines slavery. He reframes power around service rather than domination. Christian communities begin to become a place of refuge. And over generations, Ireland changes. Not because Patrick forces belief, but because he simply chose to stay. And so later centuries have turned Patrick into something else. A miracle worker, a national symbol, a saint who banishes snakes. But there's an irony there. Because the real Patrick didn't drive anything out. He just went back in. He didn't conquer, he endured. He didn't dominate culture, he planted faith in it and trusted God with the timeline. And Patrick matters because he breaks our favorite Christian fantasies. He's not impressive. He's not polished. He's not successful by modern metrics. He doesn't build institutions quickly. He doesn't see full results in his lifetime. But here's what he does. He obeys. Slowly, imperfectly, faithfully. And that kind of faith doesn't photograph well, but it does last. So St. Patrick doesn't really fit on a parade float. He's too quiet, too honest, too shaped by suffering. But he might be exactly the kind of guide we need now. Not when the church feels strong, but when it feels unsure, when faith feels costly, when obedience feels unglamorous. Patrick reminds us that Christianity spreads most deeply not through confidence or control, but through presence, patience, and love that refuses to leave. It's not a holiday story, but it sure is a faithful one. Thanks for listening to the Theology Made podcast. Please like and subscribe on whatever channel you're listening on.